Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just bear with us for a moment as we get started and let everybody in from the waiting room. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. You are with us here at the program on education policy and governance. This is our fall Colloquium Series. We appreciate your time. Without further ado, if I could introduce Professor Paul Peterson, director of our program.
Well, thank you, Antonio. Antonio is our associate director who keeps our program running every day, just like clockwork. And we're all happy to see so many of you joining us for our seminar today. Our seminar today features Nina Rees, who is the president and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, which is a leading national nonprofit organization that's supporting the charter school movement. Before I turn to our conversation today, let me remind you, if you are not aware, or if you are aware, remind you that we have an ongoing conference now, a series of webinars that are about school choice, and they occur every Friday noon. And the agenda for tomorrow's webinar is as follows. You can see it on the screen here, is political support for school choice gaining or losing ground. So we have three very significant scholars talking about school choice within school districts and elsewhere. So including a nice paper by Marcus Winters on the impact of charter schools on district schools. So thank you very much for joining us. Today, we want to turn to Nina Rees, and I'm gonna begin the conversation today with a few questions just to get the conversation started, but I urge you to prepare your own questions about charter schools that you may have on your mind. Now put a brief version of your question into the chat and I will call on you and you can pose the question yourself directly to Nina. So thank you, Nina, for joining us on our seminar today.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Well, let me first of all ask you about the recent report issued by the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, which you direct. Let me ask you, because it's quite a significant report, you have collected data from all the states across the country, the official state department, state education department, which and then compiled all the data. And you're saying that charter school enrollments increased more by a larger number than ever before in recent years. So can you elaborate on your findings?
Yes, so again, thank you so much for having me, Paul. This paper, which was just released a month or so ago, looks at data from the last school year, the 2020-21 school year. And we found that enrollment in charter schools increased by 240,000. And this doesn't include data from states like Tennessee. So if you add Tennessee, those numbers are probably even higher. But at the same time, 1.3 million students left the traditional system. So they either came to charter schools or went to a private school or a homeschool setting. And so for us, though, the 240,000 jump is a pretty significant one. We've always had great demand for charter schools, but something happened in the year that COVID hit, which prompted a lot of families to opt for charter schools. And we saw an increase in literally every state that had a charter school law, except for states like Illinois, which are really concentrated on in particular cities. So the assertion that people make that all the increase ended up in online schools is actually not supported by our paper, because not every state allows for full-time online charter schools. So we're excited about this. I think the families coming to charter schools, these are families who are coming to our space for the first time, and whether they stay with us or not, we'll know more once we get the data from this year, but we think that something about our space was attractive enough to attract these families to our sector, and hopefully most of them will stay.
But I thought the biggest problem with growth in the charter sector was a lack of space, that charter schools were filled up, that you had to have, had to win a lottery to get into a charter school in many parts of the country. How could you have such rapid growth unless you were increasing supply? Or is there some now the obvious increase in supply is through the virtual mechanism, because there's sort of no space limitation there. So if it's not in the virtual sector, then where is it?
Well, I mean, the assertion that we don't have enough space is actually not backed up in every state. I think some states like New York, for instance, are hitting caps to open new charter schools. So Massachusetts, which is where you live, New York, these are states that have actual caps that prohibit charters from expanding. In most other places, caps are not an issue. And charters are in more than inner city settings. So in those places where they had space, they attracted more students. And I will also say that this does open the discussion around expanding the reach of charter schools beyond certain jurisdictions, which is certainly what the governor of Ohio did this past year. It used to be you could only open charter schools in Cleveland and Columbus in certain settings. Now he's allowing for them to grow in more places. So it is also interesting to see what governors and legislators did last year and what they will do next year to expand the reach of charter schools. So you actually also have more of them in communities for people to be able to access. We've always seen a huge while the total number of charter schools seems to have plateaued over time, the demand and the enrollment numbers has continued to rise. So it's not, as perfect as it should be, but most of these schools they still have some space, and certainly during COVID, they were able to expand to meet the needs of the families who were coming to them.
Well, one of the issues that constantly comes up is the decisions by the state legislatures or whoever is responsible to limit the number of charter schools and the number of enrollments. And now we've seen in the latest round of elections in Virginia and New Jersey, a lot of concern about the education that students are being provided or were being provided during the pandemic and the various issues that have come up. And so we have a Republican candidate in Virginia who openly campaigned on expanding charter schools and other school choice programs. So do you see this as a straw in the wind that the political climate is changing for charters?
Well, I certainly hope so. And again, it started when the pandemic first hit, and a lot of families who normally may not have wanted to leave their public schools, noticing the problems that these traditional systems face. I live right here in Fairfax County. This is one of the most well-resourced districts in the country, and they weren't able to hire a good provider to go online. And when they did, the whole system crashed immediately. So parents, for the first time in these suburban communities, noticed how hard it was for decentralized bureaucracies to respond to a pandemic. In places like Portland, Oregon, they were waiting for federal guidance on how to make sure that special ed kids were being served if the medium was online. As a result, they were prohibiting even online charter schools from serving students because they were waiting for federal guidance. So people started to see these things in real time, and they also started to notice what was happening in their own living room by watching the interactions between teachers and their students. So right now, I think the opportunity, Paul, really is around these new families who have discovered the importance of education and the inability of a centralized system to respond. There's still a lot of love and respect for the teachers in this medium, but the way certainly a lot of union leaders responded has left a bad taste in people's mouths. And I think that's one of the things to look out for. In terms of support for choice and education in Virginia, education was the second ranked issue in terms of the things that people were looking for when they went to the ballot box. And when you look at the split between Republicans and Democrats on that issue right now, it's narrowed quite a bit from like 26 to like 3 points. Whether this will stay in place remains to be seen. A lot depends on the way people talk, Republicans talk about this issue. Education tends to normally be a Democrat issue. But our hope is that because so many people are trying to pay attention to education and choice is at the center of it, that charter schools could come out as the real winners because it is a choice that's offered within the public system with rules and regulations, and something that currently 3.5 million students are already benefiting from in a sector that's been around for 30 years.
Well, this is all fascinating. Do you feel that there's still competition between charter schools and the private sector? The private sector has been losing enrollment for quite some time. It may have rebounded now, we don't know, may not have. And certainly there is a feeling out there that a lot of students who might have gone to private school are choosing charter schools instead. After all, they don't cost money, and the private schools do. Do you feel a tension between the people that support the private school sector, the school voucher enthusiasts and the tax credit enthusiasts, have lost, don't have the same level of enthusiasm for charter schools that they might have had in the past?
Paul, as you know, I kind of come from that sector. I think some of these tensions definitely exist in those inner city settings where the Catholic school system is no longer as strong as it used to be. Right here in DC, a group of Catholic schools decided to become charter schools with all the rules and regulations that come with running a traditional or a public school system, since you cannot teach religion in a charter school. So I do think in certain pockets of the country, this tension may have existed. But I think at the end of the day, when you think about how many students are in charter schools, how many are in private schools, and where the demand is, the public sector is still much larger. So rather than fighting with each other, I think the aim ought to be around finding solutions so that more families have access to options, rather than focusing on making sure that there is enough options within an inner city setting that's already saturated, like in Washington, DC. So I'm not as steeped into the tensions, but I do think that from an advocacy standpoint, our focus ought to be on the needs of families and students. And of course, if the options in a charter setting free, more parents are going to want to pick that option versus one that requires you to pay out of pocket.
The Obama administration always supported charter schools through the race to the top, innovation, through the waiver policies for NCLB waivers, and through other actions that it took. And of course, the Trump administration had a strong support for school choice, including charter schools. How is the Biden administration positioning itself? It was ambiguous during the course of the campaign, though probably not as friendly towards charters as Obama had been. Do you see any signs as to what direction the Biden administration is taking?
That's a great question, Paul. So we've been monitoring the administration's actions around education. Of course, right now they're very busy with the pandemic, which is as it should be. Higher education certainly has been a focus of theirs, and also getting their nominees through the processes. So they've only been around for a year, and I do think they need a little bit of grace before people draw too many conclusions about their positioning on issues of innovation, and charter schools being one of them. On the campaign trail, they didn't say much about charter schools. One of his advisors did offer a couple of comments which were disturbing in terms of, getting rid of private charter schools. And as everyone on this call knows, there is no such thing as a private charter school. And when you look at the president's record as vice president and as a senator, he did not engage in the education wars, and his voting record very much aligned with that of most moderate Democrats when it came to reform, including charter schools. So we have no reason to think that he has changed his mind. I think the key factor really is the fact that the two big teachers unions played a role in getting him elected. This is the first time that's been the case since President Carter created the US Department of Education. And so with that kind of access, and given the union's opposition to charter schools, there is renewed angst, I guess, around what a federal role and what the administration can do to impact charter schools. And as I said, because they're so focused on the pandemic and other issues, they haven't necessarily done a lot. But with that said, they've also not said anything positive or talked about charter schools that much. We invited the Secretary of Education to our conference this year. He came. He's also met with our board of directors. He, used to be an authorizer in Connecticut and knows a thing or two about charter schools, but again, a lot remains to be seen.
Well, how about the COVID relief bills that were passed initially? Was there anything in those bills that took into account the challenges that the charter schools faced during the height of the pandemic? And there's some new legislation that's going through Congress, which is, we don't know quite what's in it, but is there any sign from what's happening there as to how much support charter schools have in Washington?
Well, charter schools as public schools qualify for COVID relief funds. When the first package was passed in March of 2020, $13.5 billion was disseminated to public and charter schools. In December of 2020, there was $50 billion available for public and charter schools. And then this past year, $121 billion was disseminated. And that money is supposed to go to states and LEAs and be available through 2024. Again, because charters are public schools, they qualify for those funds. But in terms of, you mentioned about the current reconciliation package. So within the bipartisan infrastructure frame, there was no funding really for K-12, but there was funding for Wi-Fi hotspots and internet connectivity. So they did put quite a bit of money to close the digital divide, which does unfortunately inflict a lot of the communities where our students live. There's also some money for clean energy and making sure school buses are running on clean energy. So that's the only thing that infrastructure bill did in order to impact public and charter schools. In the reconciliation package, there is a lot of funding for universal pre-K or access to pre-K. And so we've been studying that carefully to see exactly how it would impact charter schools. I think in those states where charters currently are operating pre-K programs, like in Washington, D.C., certainly there's going to be more money to be had. But the dollar amounts in that package for pre-K and early care and education is quite steep. And again, by default, because we're public schools, we will access it. But there is no specific line item for charter schools, if that's what you're asking.
So that's great. Now, you mentioned earlier that charter schools were more nimble or more able to adapt as schools were asked to make vast changes in a very short period of time. But is there really any evidence of that? Do we really know that charter schools did a better job of adapting to the challenges of the pandemic than the district schools?
Oh, absolutely. Every study that was done right when the pandemic hit demonstrates that they responded faster. So I think SERPI did a paper looking at the Charter School Growth Fund portfolio schools. We did a paper looking at single sites and smaller CMOs that are not part of the Growth Fund portfolio with public impact. I think Fordham did a paper also looking more at single sites. What was apparent in all of these papers is that our leaders were just more in tune with what their families needed. And because they had the authority to move dollars around, and because they have to raise money for their, in order to make sure that they keep their doors open, they access philanthropy faster, to offer Wi-Fi hotspots, or to make Chromebooks and whatnot available to their kids, or to do, people think of remote learning as something that has to happen virtually with a computer, but you can also do it in other ways. You can, do it through homework packs, calling families to make sure kids are doing their work. So the response in that spring period of time in 2020, spring of 2020, was extremely positive. Now, the record on how many of them opened is a little bit mixed. And when you talk to them, I do think they were, again, surveying their schools to see what families were comfortable with. And depending, again, on the region that you were in some instances, it wasn't so much the teachers who were leery of going back, but it was the families not feeling safe sending their children back. And there is certainly some evidence that shows that a lot of communities, especially Black families and Hispanic families, are not quite as comfortable sending their kids back to school when there's so many uncertainties. And of course, the availability of vaccines is also a question mark in some of these places. So, but with that said, we have examples of schools that decided to open to anyone who wanted to come. In other instances, they remained closed and offered virtual learning, but they had partnership with after-school programs that were offering custodial care for students to come to a setting while parents went back to work. But that story is a little bit different from what happened in March of 2020. And then again, this year, when you look at what's been going on, we've been looking at how charters are using the latest round of COVID funding, and we're going to study that more carefully to see what innovative things that they are doing in order to answer your question. But because we're more data-driven, because we have fiscal and legal autonomy to move dollars around, and because a lot of our leaders came to this space to innovate, they are certainly more agile and quick to adapt to change. But a lot of it in terms of what happens next remains to be seen. And I know there's a lot of fatigue within the system. Educators, have been through a lot. So I still think that, if I were a betting man, I would put my money on charter schools because they're just traditionally more nimble and entrepreneurial.
Well, so how about the education savings account idea, which is something that people are saying is particularly adapted to this moment in time, as people are searching for the right combination of government's support for what they want to do. Maybe they want to have their child at home more, but they want them in a pod, or maybe they want to bring in a tutor, or maybe they want a lot of specific support for certain kinds of things. But the charter school model has always been, you go to school, the government supports that school, you have a choice of that school, but you go to a school. So what do you think of these education savings accounts? Is this the wave of the future, or is this just going to be a boutique idea for a small group of people?
Well, you have to pass it. So not every state has education savings accounts or opportunities for individuals to put money in these scholarship granting organizations that then make funds available to families. Conceptually, though, I do think it's attractive to empower people, families, with greater purchasing power. And that purchasing power may not always just be about moving a child from one school to another, but through enhancing the child's learning through online mediums, purchasing coursework from best-in-class instructors. And right now, there's a lot of it also available online after COVID hit. As you know, Success Academy, KIPP, Uncommon, Achievement First, they put all of their course content online and their teacher workbooks and whatnot so that others could benefit from it. You have brought Diane Tavner to this group. She's beta tested and done a lot of these things where she's making the course content available to anyone who wants to access it. So I think it's attractive to give parents more options, get them used to owning their child's education far more than before. So it used to be seen that ed savings accounts were just about moving kids into private schools, but I think the real opportunity is in these other things that families can do to enhance their child's learning. I have a 16-year-old as an example. She's studying for the SATs, and even though she goes to an independent public school, every family in that school has a private tutor that's preparing them for the SATs, and these private tutors are very expensive. I mean, of course, I can afford to do it, but the fact that we pay out of pocket for some of these things certainly doesn't make sense. And if you're low income or even a working class middle income family, I think these costs definitely add up, and it doesn't have to be that way. You should be able to make decisions faster and also enhance your child's education, as a lot of upper income families did during COVID. But in order to do that, you need resources.
Well, is this the growth in the charter school? Is there any evidence it's being concentrated in the suburban areas? The talk is out there is that, you know, suburban parents have become disturbed with what's going on in the school system. They're looking for options. They're trying out things. Do you see any sign that the growth that's recently happened is in suburbia, or aren't you able to detect that?
Well, we've noticed interest in expanding into suburbs and rural areas for quite some time, but most of the energy has been focused on cities because the sense of urgency certainly is higher. I also think that the unions tend to be more focused on inner cities, and the case for, you know, allowing for new schools to be created in those settings where you have chronically failing schools has been made, and it's been a stronger case. Whereas if you move further out, because families have selected public schools by moving into these, you know, fancier neighborhoods, there is a perception that you've already made a choice, and so why would you go there and make other options available? And I think that's what I was saying earlier. I think the pandemic has woken people up to the fact that perhaps, you know, just having, you know, one option in a public setting, no matter how well resourced, is not enough. And so that's really the opportunity to leverage. You know, I also, as you know, I used to work on No Child Left Behind long time ago. And one of the things that I actually personally liked about the law was the fact that it made so much information available to families. It disaggregated the information so that you could see if your high-performing public school was perhaps not doing as well with a certain subgroup. And of course, as you know, a lot of suburban families did not like that disaggregation of data and the labeling of their school as a school that was in need of improvement or that was missing AYP. But I do think, you know, that is the kind of information that needs to be available to everyone so that they can themselves be more engaged in their child's education and understand whether they're, you know, these taxpayer dollars that are going to these schools are in fact yielding a high return, or whether you need to spend that much for things that you're spending in suburban settings. So there's definitely a wake-up call in suburbia, and I think a lot of it actually had to do with the fact that schools were closed for so long. And it took them so long to reopen, even after teachers were vaccinated.
Well, one of the major, before moving on to the next question, let me invite our audience to reflect on the conversation and add their questions to the chat. We'd love to have your voice. So please just put a brief version of your question into the chat and we'll call on you. But while that's happening, let me ask you the question that was on my mind, which is, a lot of people have said that charter schools take away money from the public schools. And this was a major issue here in Massachusetts in the back in 2018, when there was an effort to expand the number of charter schools through voter referendum, because charter schools thought they had the support of the public at large. But when the vote was taken, that proposed amendment fell. And the major argument that was used in the campaign was that charter schools take away money from the public schools. And so how do you answer that concern?
Well, Paul, that's been the argument made against charter schools and choice since these concepts were first introduced. And our view is that this is not the system's money, it's the child's money, and it should follow the child to the system and the school that they're attending. And so if there is more demand and interest in public charter schools, then those schools should get those funds. In terms of the arguments made, look, if you are running a central school system and you see a lot of students leaving, like we saw here in DC, you make some adjustments so that those families return to your schools and stay there. So again, you have the superintendent of Miami-Dade, Alberto Carvalho, who's spoken to this group and to your students in the past. What he has done in Miami is a great example of responding to the dynamics of a choice-based system and treating the broad panoply of schools in his system as part of the community rather than as competitors. Now, again, in reality, he probably has a system in place that also protects his district. But I think the idea is for the superintendents to seize this opportunity and do certain things in their system so that families stay in their schools rather than to treat it as, okay, this money is leaving, the child is leaving, and I'm left with nothing. And now, in the case of Miami-Dade, he certainly has been around for a long time, and most leaders in these centralized systems, especially in inner cities, don't stay in those jobs long enough to know how to adjust to these changes. And that's quite frankly the reason why we believe charters are a better model, because the leadership of these charter management organizations and charters themselves has not changed as rapidly as the leadership of center city schools around the country. So that dynamic makes it hard to have stability. And so again, at the end of the day, for us, it's about serving the needs of families and diminishing the tension between public and charter schools as much as possible. I also think, though, that our sector needs to do a better job of explaining what it does, how it's helping the community, and forging alliances where it makes sense. But also understanding that at the end of the day, their customers are the students. So I think we need to center everything back to that rather than on all the other things that the traditional system is currently caught up trying to explain.
Well, you mentioned leadership, and one of the main criticisms of charter schools in recent times has been the fact that the students are predominantly African American and Hispanic American, but the staff, the teachers, and even more so the heads, the people who are directing charter schools, are from the majority population. So what can be done to sort of provide leadership for charter schools that emerges out of the minority community itself, so that the minority community finds and can identify more clearly with the schools that their children are attending?
So actually, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, the diversity of the teacher workforce in charter schools is greater than that of the traditional system. So in the aggregate right now, we have more teachers of color in our schools than we see in traditional systems. I don't know if that number holds for when you say leadership, you're probably talking about the leadership of these charter management organizations. That's been a topic of discussion within the chartering space for quite some time. And as you know, in recent years, certainly in the past year, we've seen a lot of turnover in the leadership of these schools. Noble is an example, IDEA charter schools. So when you go down the list, a lot of these leaders are making room for people of color to take them. And what's good about this is because we're data driven and because some of these CMOs have created pipelines for their talented team to move up the ranks, it is actually easier for them to groom and bring someone to lead the work. But in terms of raw data, I don't know what the latest is. All I know is that there's just been a lot of change in the sector. And as far as I'm concerned, it's more important for the teachers, to the extent you believe that the teacher of color is going to connect better with the students that they're serving. To me, that point of entry is more important as a first order of business. And that's where we actually do quite well. And I know that this administration is very focused on that. But with all that said, I do think we need to also be able to attract more teachers to the workforce. And in our economy right now, I think there are just so many jobs and options for people who graduate from college, and whether they want to become a teacher or stay in the teacher workforce for an extended period of time, as past generations did, remains to be seen. I just think there's a lot of things about the labor market and the teaching space certainly that is changing, and we just need to, in my opinion, make sure that whatever teacher training program we're making available is something that really helps those teachers hit the ground running, and that we're testing and learning and refreshing it constantly, the way that certainly Eva Moskowitz has done with Success Academies, where she's not leaving a lot to chance, but really using her training to make sure any teacher who's exposed to a student knows what they're doing.
So we have a question here from Yolan Fang. And so, Yolan, do I have your first name correctly pronounced? And yes, go ahead. Would you like to?
Sorry, it's Jolene.
Jolene, okay.
All right, thank you.
One of my favorite friends in high school was Jolene, but it was spelled differently.
Right. That was a common. That was the more common spell.
Yeah. Yes. Well, what is your question?
Should I just say it out loud?
Sure.
Okay. I'm just wondering, because I heard you said earlier, if I didn't misheard anything, you said that how charter schools are being more entrepreneurial in nature, and just wondering, what do you think are the reasons behind it, and what are the consequences going to be for traditional public schools? And my apology for not turning on my camera. I'm just not at the place where I can do that. Sorry about that.
Well, the reason they are more entrepreneurial is because just the act of opening a charter school requires you to have a vision and a mission and a drive to, do something differently. So if you were a former teacher in a traditional system who decided to start a charter school, it's because you saw how that system worked. And so that in and of itself, makes you more prone to making adjustments fast. The other reason is, of course, the legal and fiscal autonomy that comes with running a charter school, where you have the ability to move dollars around faster rather than checking with a school district before you decide to buy paper or to do something differently. So these are just kind of some of the basic reasons that we've been given, and what we see when we go to a charter school is just that there's a greater sense of ownership, and because they're schools of choice, they have to respond to the needs of families in order to keep their doors open. In terms of the ramification on the larger school system, I mean, it used to be we wanted these innovations to transfer over. And in some instances, they have. In many instances, the districts are not paying enough attention to charter schools. And it's for two reasons. One is, to the extent there are small schools, if you're running a really large system, you're not going to have time to go and look at a couple of schools and decide, I'm going to take these best practices to scale, because they haven't done enough and they're not large enough for you to be able to transfer the information. But I also think that from a research standpoint, there's not enough money out there to do real evaluation in our schools. And that's one of the reasons why some people are not able to quickly seize on the innovation and transfer it. I would say a lot of our innovations are around management. They're not, and the ones around pedagogy are the ones, in my opinion, that need to be tested a little bit more before being taken to scale.
Well, one innovation that I think has been introduced, at least in some places, is the old-fashioned innovation of going back to the K through 8 school, and instead of having the middle school. And charter schools, I think, tend to be more of the K through 8 variety. And I think they also tend to be, they also, you know, don't have some of the same problems at the middle school level that you're finding in a lot of district schools. So, and district schools are responding to that and creating more K through 8 schools themselves in order to keep their enrollments. Am I making this up? I just have observed it in a variety of places, but do you see that happening more generally?
Well, I mean, look, most charter schools started as K through 5th grade, and they added middle schools. We have fewer charter high schools as a result, but I don't know if this is an innovation that necessarily came out of the chartering space, but I do think the models of mixing middle with elementary school are definitely one of the things that a lot of schools are looking at, and it certainly makes sense to break things up a little bit. I mean, so the other thing, Paul, also is just expanding the school day and the school year. I mean, it seems like a basic concept, but that is probably the thing that charters have done extremely well, leveraging more time in their school day and school year, and paying teachers differently in order to stay in school, to continue working with students in effective ways that are connected back to what's being taught in the classroom. So again, I don't know how exciting of an innovation it is, but that's definitely something that's worked really well for us. And when people talk about what can be transferred, that certainly is one of those things. But you have to be able to negotiate terms with if you're a unionized school, you're going to have to make sure your teachers can stay after school to do these things. And so having the freedom to do that, because you're not part of a collective bargaining union group, is one of the reasons we're able to do it faster and better.
Well, one of the hottest issues out there today is critical race theory and whether it should be taught in school. And the 1619 project that the New York Times has put out, which isn't exactly claim itself to be critical race theory, but is often seen as a good example of how you might take concepts from critical race theory and apply them in a pedagogical setting. So does the charter sector have any view on this? Is there disagreement within the charter sector? What is the opinion of charter school leaders with respect to this new curricular development that's sort of a topic of intense conversation across the country?
Paul, look, there's huge diversity in our sector around what's being taught in our schools. And again, one of the innovations of chartering is that, individuals come to our space in order to try new things. And we certainly believe that you need to have that kind of diversity. These are schools of choice. And so if they have a pedagogy that is a little bit more focused on teaching about the history of race and critical race theory, so to speak, they have the freedom to do that. And if they have a different kind of model and parents are attracted to those schools because they're teaching history a different way, they certainly currently have the autonomy to do that as well. But as a whole, I would also just say that we all benefit from knowing about history, whether it's good or bad. So from a factual standpoint, I think it's best to offer information and make sure people know about the rich history of this country. As an immigrant, when I'd like to tell the story, when I'm from Iran, so we left after the revolution, but we stayed in Iran for a few years before my father finally was able to get a job here in the US. And one of the first things that the Islamic Republic did was to get rid of the history of Iran, which was, a history of monarchy and kings and whatnot, and replaced it with a history of Islam. So I was learning about Islam and everything that, Muhammad had done in the 3 years before I left Iran. So I never, again, it's a very different country, of course, but I think getting rid of one thing and replacing it with another is never attractive to me. I think people need to learn as much as possible about where they were in order to then determine where they're headed.
Well, some people draw the distinction between history and heritage, which I think is an interesting concept because, you know, on the one hand, history, of course, you select facts whenever you teach history. You can't teach everything. You can only teach some things because everything is too much. So when in selecting your facts, you tend to select facts that often relate to the heritage that you want students to remember or to understand. So, and it seems to me like the major debate here is over whether or not you select the facts in American history that sort of celebrate the ideals of the country, freedom, equality, opportunity, or whether or not you select the facts that sort of identify the tragedies of the past, the perpetuation of slavery even beyond the end of the Civil War through serfdom and through Jim Crow laws and of course I don't want to just say this was happening in the South, but the segregation that persisted throughout the country down to the end of the 20th century. So which facts should be selected to be taught to students at a charter school?
Well, again, as I said earlier, Paul, charters are all different. They're all constructed differently. And we as an organization at the national level that's in favor of creating as many options as possible don't take a position on what should be taught. And as you know, if you were to just look at the history of history standards and the discussions at the state level around it, you know that it's you've asked me a very difficult question to answer. So, but on critical race theory, though, I do think also when people talk about CRT, I don't think any of our schools are teaching critical race theory the way it's taught. It is a graduate level course. So we're kind of conflating that with, the teaching of facts and whatnot. I just personally think the more people know both about their history in this country and even more importantly about the history of other countries and how they've evolved, the better off they are. And certainly, again, as an immigrant, I firmly believe in the values that are instilled in this country. And the reason why so many immigrants come to the US and so many are waiting at the border to come to this country is because of the hope and opportunity they have here, as opposed to the countries that they're fleeing from. A lot of it is rooted in the belief in freedom and the ideals of individual rights and liberties.
So, but are charter schools adding to the segregation in our country? Are they reinforcing segregation? A lot of people are saying that school choice is just a new tool to segregate our schools. How do you respond to those concerns?
Well, Paul, I think you well know, based on studies done by the Urban Institute and other places, that to the extent the makeup of our students is of a certain makeup, it has to do with the fact that we're drawing families from communities that are more segregated. You can have excellent schools where the majority of the student population is Black or Latinx, so our focus ought to always be around excellence. And if it's about diversity, and I see Sonia Park is on the line, we need to encourage the creation of more diverse by design schools, and charter schools certainly have paved the way to demonstrating how that can happen. But we have to be very intentional about the policies we put in place in order to make that happen. So to the extent, if you really want a diverse by design school, it has to be in a community that can attract from different parts of a city. A lot of these schools are not predominantly Title I schools, or they don't have enough Title I funding to become, or they don't have enough Title I students in order to become a school that's capturing Title I funds in the way that other Title I schools capture them. From a philanthropic standpoint, if there's a huge premium on serving students on free and reduced lunch, again, diverse by design schools may not get enough funding. So I think ultimately, the more students can be in settings where they're interacting with students of different cultures and ethnicities, but also, even more importantly, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, you will make for a better ecosystem that reflects the world that they will enter after they leave school. But from a policy standpoint, I think we need to be a little bit more intentional and to make sure these schools can grow.
Well, you mentioned in speaking about diversity, you mentioned that the charter sector has no one model for what should be taught, that the curriculum can differ, that each entrepreneur can decide how to approach some of these controversial questions. But that has actually been identified by some people as what's wrong with the charter sector, that it's going to lead to balkanization, and people are going to have, they're going to be presented with different views of our society and different understandings, and it's going to intensify the conflicts that we have in our society. So do we have any reason to think that charter schools are adding to this feeling of polarization that's in our society, or are they ameliorating it?
Well, I definitely don't think we're adding to it. I think to the extent there is polarization, it's a symptom of a lot of other things that are happening in our country. And certainly the pandemic has not helped. I mean, the more I was on Capitol Hill yesterday, and the more you were just talking to people over Zoom rather than having individual conversations face to face, the more you're going to, distance yourself from the people you actually need to sit down with to convince and bring on board. So yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it's part of a larger discussion. And I think we need to make sure the adults in this work are talking to each other a lot more, rather than to place the blame on students and educators.
So the research out on charter schools has always said there's really not that much difference in how much kids learn on average when you look at it across the country. Yes, you can find some charter schools that are doing a tremendous job, but you can also find charter schools that are not doing it as well as the district school just around the corner. There's a tremendous variety in this country, and on average, there's not a lot of difference, people say. So, is there really has charters on the ground over the decades, and they've been around now for 20 years, so it's time to do an assessment. Is that what impact have they had on student achievement? Have they really had? Are they doing a better job of educating young people than the standard public school that has been the warp and woof of American society for 100 years and more? So have they proven to be justified?
Well, Paul, we usually cite the work that you recently did, looking at NAEP data. And when you look at that data set, you do see huge improvements in academic outcomes, especially for Black students and low-income students. If you look at Stanford's Credo, the first study that they did not show a lot of differences, but the 2015 study definitely showed huge differences in achievement when you compared students in charter schools to similar students in the neighborhood in which they live. So yes, in the aggregate, you may not see huge improvements, but when you go down to the communities where charters are located, you see huge improvements. And of course, if we had more longitudinal data, you'd be able to see even greater outcomes, because most of these students graduate, they go to college, they go into the workforce. And I think there was at least one study I've seen that shows the long-term economic outcome of students who graduated from charter schools from Chicago and Florida was much higher than the salaries of those students who left and came from the traditional public school system. So again, these are schools of choice. People are selecting them because they're fitting the unique needs of the students and whatever the family wants for the students. And so I do think it's just one of those instances where the academic data is really important, but I also making sure that what you're teaching is unique and fits the needs of the child is even more important. And that sometimes doesn't get captured when you do studies that just use test scores as the benchmark.
Yes, well, that's responsive, but how about the virtual schools? I mean, I think the studies that are out there of charter virtual schools are coming up with very clear negative findings that the students are not doing as well as students who are going to school in person nearby. So, and yet this is probably the fastest growing sector within the charter school movement. So can you comment on the role of the virtual charter school?
Yes, Paul. And in fact, we looked at the sector and produced a paper with 50 CAN and NACSA that made the case for regulating that space and treating it a little bit differently from regular brick and mortar charter schools. The reality is that the average student attending a virtual charter school is not going to stay in that system for a long period of time. And to the extent that sector has targeted credit recovery students or students who've dropped out of high school to go back to work and whatnot, those students are also a little bit more difficult to target in terms of an audience that will benefit from online learning. You have to be highly motivated and a self-starter in order to go and follow the instructions a certain way. So I still think as an innovation, it's something that you have to make available, and the pandemic certainly made that case. But I think that in order for the online charter space to thrive, you need students who are going to actually follow the instructions the same way. If you're sick, the antibiotics are only going to be effective if you take it every day, so to speak. So they need to be regulated differently, in our opinion, for them to thrive and succeed. And you definitely need an adult. If the student is younger, you need someone who's moving them through the coursework. But yeah, the results, if you just look in the aggregate and compare them to brick and mortar schools, the numbers are not very good. But I also think they're dealing with very different types of students and students who don't stay in that medium long enough for you to be able to really determine whether the school had an impact on the child or something else. So, we need to do more, but I also think regulators need to do a better job of really managing the online charter sector better.
Well, Nina, we're running up to our deadline here. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for covering such a broad ground of questions so thoughtfully and so clearly. Do you have anything that you'd like to say as we wrap up?
No, but if anyone has any questions, our website is publiccharters.org, and you can also follow me at Nina Charters on Twitter. We, are grateful to you, Paul, and to your program for all your contributions to the education sector. Read your work religiously, so thank you for your leadership in this area.
Well, thank you very much, Nina, for joining us on our seminar today. This has been Nina Rees, the president of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Thank you very much for thank you all for joining us for our PEPG seminar, our final PEPG seminar of the term, but we'll be back next semester. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.